It seems that music has always been around. It wasn't invented any more than was fire and water. Music and its place in history is a series in 14 episodes. Its aim is to be a primer, or an overview, of music throughout history, offering an infinite number of triggers that could inspire more research and study. The last episode was about the Renaissance. Something significant occurred during that period. An obsession with renewal spurred learning and creativity at a standard so high that the results seem even superhuman. In a way, the Renaissance proved what humans can achieve, and the artists of the Renaissance may have met or even surpassed their intent, that is, to recover antiquity's greatness. The art of the Renaissance was fueled by an inconceivable amount of money, and that level of spending was sure to be unsustainable. But while the money lasted, the finest skills and talent came together and rose together, and we had the paintings, the sculpture, the structures, and a plentiful written record to show for it. This episode is about the Baroque period and the 17th century. The seeds of the Baroque spirit were planted in the 16th century. For example, the Renaissance showed us that music, too, can be art. Like a painting or sculpture, the materials of sound can be assembled into an architectural whole that stands complete, and the work can achieve that same level of lofty goal. A craft of musical composition had become established. During the 16th century, composers' understanding of form, melody, and harmony evolved from rough-hewn to polished. The concept of the triad as a building block of harmony and harmonic progression became increasingly obvious. Interestingly, it was not so before. If there is one thing to blame for the end of the Renaissance, it is that there was much less money for a while, at least in the way it had been flowing. The Reformation had set off a messy result. The 30 Years' War started in 1618 as battles between Roman Catholics and Protestants. As the war dragged on, it became less and less about religion and more about who would rule what land. More and more areas of Europe were drawn into conflict, and, in the end, the war caused an excessive human toll, brought about poverty and disease, and laid waste to many Germanic territories. At the middle of the 17th century, autonomies had become established for Germany and the Holy Roman Empire, France, Spain, Sweden, Austria, and the Netherlands. Italy, as a consequence, became more disunited and rigidly stratified between rich and poor. Authoritarian rule of monarchies became the norm around the world, in the empires and kingdoms of Europe, in England, in Russia, and throughout Asia. So the 17th century was a time of contrasts. Emotions ran high, yet war is humbling. The irrationality of fear is contrasted with the growing knowledge in science, which exposed the truth of natural law. The extravagance of kings was shocking compared to the abundance of poverty. The desire for freedom competed with the need to control. The grandeur of a cathedral or a palace rose among the homes of the poor. In visual art, Caravaggio exhibits the Baroque with his dramatic scenes, accentuated with maximum chiaroscuro, that is, surface illumination and shadow. Every detail is attended to, but the aim is to go beyond depiction. There's a dramatic purpose, an intention to show the depth of feelings, from joy to misery. Bernini's famous sculptures do this as well. This is the Baroque style of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. In complete contrast, the 17th century was the time of painters from the Netherlands, like Rembrandt and Vermeer, whose paintings are so exact and realistic that they take on a photographic quality. The angst is largely absent, replaced by expressive brushstroke and composition. How can Caravaggio and Rembrandt be from the same period? Whereas the Italian Renaissance was enamored by the mythology of religion and that of ancient Greece and Rome, in the Netherlands there was more grounding in domestic reality. The impact of the results, however, is just as powerful. The two are opposites, but not disconnected. Emotional rawness and the scientific rationality both existed in the 17th century, as if on the same continuum, representing a place between two extremes. Scientists sought a scientific process involving both speculation and observation, a mixture of guessing and proving, accepting, in other words, that the best avenue to truth is in the middle of two extremes. Scientists like Isaac Newton and philosophers like Descartes found no conflict between religion and science. The ambiguity of the middle was fuel for discovery, and opposites were considered an invaluable pairing. Vermeer used a lens and projection to help make his work achieve its accuracy, a perfect example of how science was used at the time to advance expression in the arts. The music of Claudio Monteverdi resides throughout the expressive continuum. St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice had hired him as choir master. Like Giovanni Gabrieli, who preceded him, he was inspired by the dramatic potential of music, especially in the unique space of St. Mark's. His sacred music for the church, like this Magnificat from his 1610 Vespers, has the same drama as Gabrieli's great polychoral works. Monteverdi was just as committed to secular music. He was a master of the Italian Madrigal, which used music to express particular emotions of a text with charm and directness. Madrigals usually favor a homophonic texture, that is, a principal melody supported by a chordal accompaniment, and depict a particular emotion from somber to joyous, and moods from severe to humorous. This is the first part of a madrigal from Monteverdi's sixth book of such works. Monteverdi was also part of a group of singers and composers who sought to get back to the bare basics of melody writing. The Greeks, they felt, pursued just the right melody for a given text, and the purity of such a melody is too easily obliterated by complex musical settings. Some words just need sensitive treatment with no encumbrance. This was the aim of monody, song with the simplest of accompaniment. Here's an example from one of Monteverdi's contemporaries, Jacopo Peri. Monteverdi embraced all these styles of musical expression, from the simplest of tunes to the most dramatic and powerful. The full range of style and mood were available to tell a complex story. By the beginning of the Baroque, theater had considerable presence. Ancient Greek tragedies served as the model for courtly mask entertainment, and madrigals were being assembled into madrigal plays. Literature during the 17th century included Milton's Paradise Lost and the poetry of John Donne, and the work of Molière and Voltaire. It's the start of Japanese kabuki theater, and of course it's the time of William Shakespeare, whose plays were turning heads with their humor, satire, and insight. Opera is, of course, a work of theater and storytelling in which music is elevated in importance. The story is told with singers playing the various characters, and accompanying instrumental ensemble supports the music. Staging and scenery can range from simple to spectacular, and a chorus was often used as a way to comment on the action. Monteverdi's first opera appeared in 1607. L'Orfeo is the first opera written that is still regularly performed today. The Greek myth of Orpheus and Eurydice has been told countless times in literature, theater, opera, and musical theater. Orpheus is a musician of the greatest ability and who feels and loves with intensity. When his bride dies, he seeks to recover her soul from the underworld. His music wins him the opportunity to do so, on the condition that he will trust her thoroughly upon the exit, or lose her forever. The sample here is from the second act. Orpheus was just told of Eurydice's death. Orpheus sings and the chorus comments as he prepares to make the journey to Hades. He is full of fear, but he knows he must try, even if it means a fateful outcome.
Se morta mia vita ed io respiro, tu sei da me partita, sei da me partita per mai più non tornare, ed io rimango, no, che si versi alcuna cosa buona, non andrò sicuro più profondi abissi. Intenerito il cor del re dell'oro, trarotti a rivedere le stelle. E se ciò negherà mio destino, rimarrò teco in compagnia di morte. Addio terra, addio cielo e sole, addio.
There was an audience ready for this composite of music and spectacle, and by 1700 opera houses were being built throughout Europe. Opera's popularity spread. French operas were written, almost always involving some component of ballet. And in England, productions used spoken dialogue to tell the story. Opera therefore evolved somewhat nationalistically, with variations depending upon the language and the intended audience. In London, England, opera houses sprang up to produce operas in English, and other opera houses were being built to produce Italian opera, full-blown grand operas in Italian. For some reason, London audiences clamored for Italian opera, and their favorite composer under the auspices of the English king was George Frederick Handel. He wrote 46 operas for the English audience, even though his native language was German. But Handel's fame through the centuries would not have been solidified if he hadn't turned later in life to the oratorio. An oratorio is also a dramatic work, but it is less lavish in production because it can dispense with the staging. The music, written for chorus and orchestra, often tells a familiar story, such as one drawn from the Bible. And the oratorios he wrote for the London audience were in English. Handel wrote more than 30 oratorios. The best-known Handel oratorio is The Messiah, an enduring masterpiece. The full oratorio is between 2.5 to 3 hours. Many performances include only the first part, plus the Alleluia chorus that ends the second part. The performances, a Christmas season staple, are about an hour. In the background, we've been listening to the opening arioso in which God implores peace and preparedness. Following is a famous chorus that comes halfway through the first part of the oratorio. It is interesting to compare Handel with his contemporary, Johann Sebastian Bach. They were both born in the same year, 1685, about 100 miles from each other. Handel had the career of a superstar, working mostly in England under the patronage of the English king, writing theatrical works for a thrilled audience. Bach stayed close to home, and his career became inextricably linked with the Lutheran Church and the Lutheran aesthetic. Bach never wrote an opera. His theatrically oriented works are mostly religious and include oratorios, two passions, his monumental B minor Mass. When working for St. Thomas Church in Leipzig, Germany, he also had the obligation of composing a cantata for each week's service. A cantata is similar to an oratorio, but it is smaller in scale, more intimate, shorter, and personal. In his career, Bach wrote more than 200 cantatas, and they typically conclude with a Lutheran chorale in an elaborate sublime harmonization. A chorale is a single-line Lutheran melody, akin to Roman Catholic Gregorian chant. This cantata, Christlichen Todesbanden, is based on a chorale written by Martin Luther. The selections are the last two movements of the 8-movement cantata. First, the sopranos and tenors sing in counterpoint with a simple accompaniment, and then the full chorus performs the chorale in 4-part harmony. During the 17th century, a large share of written music was for voice, either solo or choral. But instrumental music composition was becoming more common. Bach was a first-rate organist and harpsichordist. His contributions to instrumental music were as significant as were his contributions for voice. Perhaps because of his keyboard prowess, he grappled with tuning. Pythagorean tuning was based on the simple relationships between pitches in the overtone series. All secondary pitches were therefore related to the given fundamental pitch. An instrument built on the overtone series could not modulate to a different key. Some instruments could flex their tunings automatically, like the violin or the voice. But a keyboard instrument's tuning is fixed, so unless some compromise is made, the instrument would need to be retuned at every change of key. Each of Bach's 2 volumes of the Well-Tempered Clavier has a paired prelude and fugue in each of the 12 major and 12 minor keys. This comprehensive exploration of tonality would serve as proof that tuning compromises on the keyboard were useful, and the inherent flaws were acceptable relative to their benefits. Thus, well-tempered. The Well-Tempered Clavier also proved the viability of major and minor as the 2 musical modes that could express the full range of emotion, thereby setting the old church modes and Greek modes as belonging to antiquity. The pairing of a prelude and fugue is Baroqueness in miniature. Bach was a great contrapuntist, which means he could write music that was thoroughly polyphonic. He wrote many fugues, a strict polyphonic form of scientific and exacting qualities, which he preceded with a prelude, or a toccata, or a fantasy, some piece of similar length that was comparatively improvisatory in nature and free in form. These works, the preludes and fugues, toccata and fugue, fantasia and fugue, and the like, were often written for keyboards like the clavichord, harpsichord, or organ. As gems of the keyboard repertoire, they delight us for the opposite characters in the pairing and for their invention and musical integrity. Another of Bach's contributions is his mastery of harmony and harmonic progression. His grasp of harmony was extensive, but thinking this way was still quite new for musicians. To reinforce the hearing of harmony, the composers of the Baroque period included a basso continuo in their scores. The basso continuo had two roles. Some bass instrument, like a cello, bassoon, or the pedals of the organ, would play the written bass line, and the keyboard player, on a harpsichord or on the manuals of the organ, would improvise the harmony based on a code of numbers written in the bass part. The figured bass of the basso continuo contributes to the Baroque sound. By the end of the 18th century, that aural assistance was no longer needed. The stark contrasts that are characteristic of the Baroque appear in another Baroque invention, the concerto. A concerto is a piece of music for a soloist or a soloist group, pitted against the sound of the orchestra. The form has multiple movements, usually 3, in which a slow expressive movement is sandwiched between faster ones. Bach wrote the famous Brandenburg concertos, which are concerto grossi, which means that it features a small soloing ensemble accompanied by the orchestra. The soloing group in this case is a trumpet, oboe, recorder, and violin. The accompaniment is a string orchestra. Listen for the harpsichord, which is playing the harmonic part of the basso continuo. Antonio Vivaldi worked for a school in Venice, Italy, an orphanage known as the Ospedale della Pietà. The orphanage housed hundreds of children, and one of the areas of study was music. Vivaldi was the instructor, and his best female students were selected for further in-depth training. It was for this orphanage and his student performers that he wrote many of his 450 or so concertos. And by the end of the 17th century, the reputation of this all-girl orchestra's concerts had grown such that they drew visitors from all over Europe. As this episode concludes, we'll hear the fourth concerto from Vivaldi's colorful cycle of solo violin concertos called The Four Seasons. This fourth concerto is nicknamed Winter. The 17th century rolled into the 18th, and science came more to the foreground. The ideas that religion and science, emotions and rational thought were ends on a continuum coexisting as extremes gradually changed such that learning about the world and how it worked separated and entered the laboratory of reasoned experiments and discovery. By the time J.S. Bach died in 1750, at the age of 65, his carefully wrought music of harmonic invention and contrapuntal fancy were generally out of fashion. His sons, C.P.E. Bach and Wilhelm Friedemann Bach, were in style instead, writing music with aristocratic flamboyance and witty flair. The times had changed again.